And I do think one of the very happy stories for Republicans and conservatives right now is the impressive team of younger office holders and also people running for office that the Republican Party now has. I mean, if you go around the country and go talk to Scott Walker in Wisconsin and Governor Snyder in Michigan and Governor Scott in Florida and Bobby Jindal in Louisiana. Mitch Daniels isn't quite as young, but still an incredibly successful governor in Indiana, in a state that Obama won in 2008. He got reelected by 18-point margin, I think. Kristol, obviously, in New Jersey. Paul Ryan, Marco Rubio. I mean, that's an impressive. Most of these people were not in office, obviously, many years ago. A lot of them hadn't been in politics. Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, a businessman who ran. I remember everyone saying in Washington at the time, well, if Tommy Thompson, the former governor of Wisconsin, doesn't run, no chance of beating Feingold. And I remember saying, well, I don't know, it's sort of a new mood out there. Maybe some businessman who just says, I'm not a politician, I'm going to go to Washington and try to straighten things up, could actually win. Oh no, you don't have all those political skills, you don't have a chance. And so, of course, Ron Johnson beat Feingold by, I don't know, 8 points or something in Wisconsin. Walker won, Republicans won both houses, a state that Obama carried by 7 points. So the good news from a Republican and conservative point of view, I think, is there's a new generation emerging. And I would say, incidentally, not everyone in this new generation has to be literally new. I think the key is to be young in spirit. There are some very good senators and congressmen who came back to politics who also have been very effective, I think, in the last year or two, or someone like Mitch Daniels, let's say, who's in politics a long time. But the point is people have adjusted to the new moment. I think some of the candidates running next time, I'm not thinking of Connecticut actually, but outside of Connecticut, some young Iraq and Afghanistan vets running in states like Ohio for senator, Arkansas, the 4th District, a friend of mine named Tom Cotton, who went to Harvard Law School after 9/11, volunteered for the Army, was an officer in Iraq, got back, worked for McKinsey for a year or two, and is now running in an open seat in the 4th Congressional District in Arkansas. He's going to win, I think, be a 34-year-old congressman. And there are a lot more people like that on the Republican and conservative side, and that really gives me a lot of hope. The presidential race, these are always unpredictable. Most of the people I wanted to run chose not to run. Seem to be immune to my arguments. I don't know why. Chris is the only person I know. I didn't even try to get to run if I should have. Mitch Daniels said no. Paul Ryan said no. Chris Christie said no. I even thought about Jeb Bush because he was an excellent governor, though maybe another Bush would be a test of the system at this point. Marco Rubio was a little young, he could have run, but for whatever reason, really for individual reasons, I think, they chose not to run, and we have the field we have. And I think the main lesson, I'll just close with this, the main lesson I would take is this. I don't think 2012 is going to look like 1980, in the sense that 1980, especially in a kind of gauzy retrospect, nostalgic retrospect, Reagan was there, he had come close in '76, he'd been governor of California for 2 terms, he was the leader of the conservative movement, he won the Republican primary, beat back a pretty good challenge from George H.W. Bush. We put on the ticket, so you had a very heavyweight ticket, Reagan and Bush, leaders of each wing of the party. Reagan had been tested, he'd won twice in California, a tough state, and he was the kind of the guy everyone wanted to follow out of the wilderness and into power, and indeed he close race against Carter for quite a while. There was one debate. Carter was ducking debates, insisting that John Anderson be in the debates. He was running as a third-party candidate that year. Reagan actually debated Anderson, I've once forgotten this, early in October to show that he wasn't scared of debates, did well against Anderson and helped knock Anderson down to about, I think, 7%, which is where he ended up. I mean, think of that, Anderson had run in the Republican primary, so it was dangerous to Reagan to have another Republican on the ballot, actually. Reagan knocked Anderson down, and then Carter finally was forced to agree to a debate. They debated 8 days before the election. Kind of a pressure situation there. The Monday night, I think it was, a week before the election. Reagan did just fine, contrary to everyone's expectations, that Carter was somehow so much smarter and such a better debater. Reagan won, and that was kind of a great election. I remember election night that night, and everyone, the excitement among anyone who had been in any way associated with the conservative movement or the Republican Party. There's no Reagan this time. It's not going to quite be that kind of election, I think. But there are plenty of other ways to have a very to defeat an incumbent and to have a consequential election. In '92, the Democratic field looked weak. People who were supposed to run didn't run. Cuomo, I went back and looked this up for about 2 minutes. Cuomo, the governor of New York, Bill Bradley, the senator from New Jersey, Al Gore, very well respected at that time, senator from Tennessee, who run a pretty good race in '88 for the Democratic nomination, and Gephardt, who had run a good race also in '88. None of them ran in '92. They were sort of intimidated by George H.W. Bush, who had a temporarily high poll rating. Clinton ran against a very weak field, staggered to the nomination after his various problems. Perot ran, it was a total mess. At one point, Perot was ahead, Clinton was third. People forget what a kind of wacky year '92 was. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, Clinton won and ended up being, in his way, I suppose, a reasonably successful president. And of course, in 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt beat Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt was not considered a Reagan-like character. He was a one-term governor of New York. I went back and did. If anyone here knows a lot of history, I may get called out on this. My impression from a little research is Roosevelt was a one-term governor of New York. He'd been elected in 1928. He succeeded Al Smith, who was generally considered a very exciting and dynamic and successful governor. Roosevelt was considered much more of a kind of trimmer, kind of go along, get along. He'd been a reformer, then he decided to get along with Tammany. He was mostly, people thought, a success in politics because of his last name. He was a cousin, third cousin or something of Teddy Roosevelt. That's why he put on the ticket in 1920, losing ticket. And that was it. He'd run for vice president in 1920 and gotten crushed. He was, in his first term as governor of New York, New York was in terrible shape because of the Depression. He was not considered as exciting a governor as Al Smith, or as others around the country, actually, who were much more dynamic, progressive leaders. But he was a good politician. He was acceptable to the whole party. He won the nomination. He balanced the ticket with his vice presidential pick in the South, won the election, and that turned out to be a pretty consequential president. I think that might be more the model of how this next realignment will have to work. We all have to probably put 1980 out of our mind a little bit and think more about a president who is good at holding the Republican and conservative coalition together. But the ideas for Roosevelt, the ideas for the New Deal, came from intellectuals, they came from think tanks. They didn't have think tanks then, but they came from universities, the equivalent of think tanks. A lot of the leadership in the New Deal came from the Senate and the House. A lot of the important legislation was not really written by Roosevelt. It was written by actual Senator Wagner in New York, the labor legislation. And then Roosevelt was, signed off on it, basically. That might be the model for a Republican administration in 2013. And that administration is going to have a lot to do, obviously. And I'd say it's, very, very briefly, it's two tiers, I think, of things to do. One, fix what Obama's done, which will take a while. Repeal Obamacare, correct some of the foreign policy and defense mistakes, figure out how to begin paying down this terrible debt we've accumulated. But then I think a bolder reform agenda in terms of entitlements, in terms of public policy, in terms of relimiting government, that needs to follow on the simply doing no more harm and fixing the worst parts of the Obama agenda. So the next president, the next couple of presidents maybe, and Congress are going to have an awful lot to do. It's going to need a kind of reformist energy and imagination. I think it's going to need conservatives to rethink some issues, be open to somewhat new ways of getting to the same ends, because you can't just Xerox stuff from 20 years ago and go back to that. There's going to be, I think, a healthy debate among conservatives and Republicans. I think there is right now in magazines like the Weekly Standard and among some of the politicians about how do you get from here to there. But I think that fundamentally reforming the entitlement state, reforming the welfare state, relimiting government, re-strengthening constitutional boundaries, and strengthening the U.S. abroad, that's a pretty ambitious and pretty exciting, actually, agenda for conservatives. It may not quite feel like 1980, but I think in some ways the work that has to be done over the next few years is just as important as the work that was done in the 80s. Let me stop there, and we have at least a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes for questions.
What is your view if Romney were to get the nomination about his hesitancy or not hesitancy of repealing Obama?
I think if Romney were to get the nomination, what do I think he would do about Obamacare? I mean, he has said he won't admit that Romneycare was a mistake, which it was. And I think he'd be better off, honestly, at this point, just saying, I tried to do the best I could. I worked with conservative think tanks like Heritage. It turns out it hasn't worked very well, and I wouldn't do that again. his pride or maybe his genuine belief, doesn't let him say that. So instead he tries to distinguish Romneycare from Obamacare, and there are some distinctions. But he's utterly committed to repealing Obamacare, and I think more committed now than he was a few months ago. I think that's part of the dynamic of the primary process, and that's why these processes are somewhat healthy, incidentally. So I think he will repeal Obamacare if he's the nominee. I think he's the likely, I didn't really talk about the particular candidates, he is the likely nominee, presumably, at this point. So it's striking the resistance to him among Republican primary voters. I think Republican primary voters, the last poll I saw, 68% of them say they could still change their mind. Another poll I saw, 81% said they could still change their mind. So actually, I think there's a lot of, which I think is healthy. A lot of people are looking at the candidates. They want to see what they have to say. They fall in love briefly with different candidates. You know, Bachmann had a little surge. Perry came in and looked great. It turned out not to be quite as good as people hoped. Kaine has now, of course, had a great wave, really a fantastic month until the last week or so, where he had little problems to deal with. We'll see how that goes. Kissinger was giving him advice on that. That's a funny idea. And I mean, I suppose when all this settles down, you've got to assume that Romney is the nominee. I don't really think the Kaine movement is sustainable. What Kaine shows, though, is the appetite among Republican primary voters for big ideas and for bold ideas, I think, and not for business as usual. Now, Romney's giving a speech today, right now, I think, which he goes much further than he has in embracing a kind of Paul Ryan type vision of entitlement reform, of making clear that he's not just going to tinker around the edges. I think that's the right thing to do. I think that is what Dan is right. We need that. We need big reforms. $1.3 trillion deficit you can't get by, squeezing out a little waste and fraud in the energy department. Calls for that too. And we need big ideas, and I think it's also politically sound. So I think that's where the public is. So I think Romney will move in that direction if he becomes the nominee. And again, I think he's likely to be the nominee. My only prediction would be, I think there will be a little bit of a Newt Gingrich movement over the next month or two. Honestly, if you look at the field and try to think about the dynamics of it, for conservatives who aren't happy with Romney, I don't think they go back to Bachmann. Perry has a chance, obviously, he's the governor of Texas. He's been so bad in the debates, it's hard to know if he can recover. If Kaine does falter, Newt's sort of there, and Newt's a very impressive guy. I'm not sure he should be president of the United States, but he's a very impressive guy. And there'll be a little bit of a moment when people look and think, well, what about Newt, And I mean, the truth is, a Gingrich-Romney debate in March of 2012 would be good. I mean, it would be healthy for the party. And I think it would be, whoever won the nomination after that would be a stronger candidate than if there weren't any debate, any fight.
In light of the amount of debt the United States is owned by China, is there any advantage to conservatives at this point for making the kind of moral case against China that Reagan made against Russia?
I mean, I'm a sort of China hawk in the sense, I'm not for self-destructive trade wars, but I am for a strong defense posture against China and for raising human rights concerns and pushing them towards liberalization, political liberalization. I don't know how much we can do of that, but if they don't liberalize, I think they remain a dangerous nation in certain ways, because they are a classic, if you look at history, nations that boom economically, that don't modernize politically, are dangerous nations. I mean, they're not dangerous for now, because for now they're making money and buying our debt and having some clout over us. But if they hit a recession, if things go wrong, the way a sclerotic party at a ruling class that's lost legitimacy stays in power is often through a kind of international adventures. People underestimate how much the economic growth in Asia, India, China, Vietnam, all those nations, is due to our basic defense posture there. I mean, there's been peace in East Asia since 1978. I don't think there's ever been 30 years of peace in East Asia for centuries. And that's one reason that everyone's been able to, India and China, have performed this pretty amazing accomplishment with our help of keeping an open trading system and an open capital system and a sound defense system. They've performed this pretty amazing feat of getting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and into the middle class, which is a good thing, particularly for the world. It's a little bit of a problem short term for us, all these jobs go to India, but it's better to have a rising and prosperous India and China than the opposite. So I think we take that a little too much for granted. So I'm not sure what exactly to do about China, except to how to keep strong in Asia, keep strong in our alliances with Japan and Australia and other nations, deepen the relationship with India,